Maggie Lawson realized she had been erased from the future of the very man she had once saved on a late Thursday evening at the end of summer, inside the almost dark offices of Lawson Construction on the outskirts of Dallas, while the city outside still held the day's heat in the asphalt. And inside the small two-story building, there was only the bluish-white glare of fluorescent lights pouring over the empty conference room, making the black leather chairs, the glass table, and the sample boards of building materials on the shelves looked cold, like props left behind after a performance. Maggie had not planned to stay late. She had promised herself many times that she would stop being the last person to turn off the lights at her husband's company, stop being the one who checked every wrong invoice, every late payment, every email from the bank, every call from suppliers asking when they would be paid. But promises to herself were always the first thing sacrificed when a marriage had trained a person to believe that if she did not hold everything together, everything would collapse. She had come to the office only to pick up a debt restructuring contract that Richard said he had accidentally left in the conference room after the afternoon meeting with the bank. He had called her at 6:15, his voice tired but gentle, saying he needed the scan first thing in the morning, saying he did not want to bother her, but if she could swing by, he would be grateful. Maggie had heard the words, "I'll be grateful," too many times over the past 2 years. So many times that they no longer sounded like gratitude, but like a key that unlocked the weakest part of her. She was 42, the finance director of a mid-sized logistics company, the kind of woman her colleagues called frighteningly calm. But the moment Richard said he needed her, some part of her still returned to an old instinct. Check, fix, brace, answer before anyone could be disappointed. She was wearing a white button-down shirt, black slacks, her dark brown hair twisted into a low bun, and the heels that had been hurting her since 5 o'clock. But when she walked into Lawson Construction, she still went straight to the conference room, as if she were walking into a place she was responsible for saving from dust and calla. See, company was not in her name. It was not her office. It was not originally her dream, but her fingerprints were everywhere. In the restructured loan, in the payment schedule pinned to the accounting office wall, in the client contracts she had personally called and begged not to withdraw, in every email she rewrote so Richard would sue and be more trustworthy, in every personal guarantee she had signed beneath legal language that now made her feel cold all the way down her spine. The file was not where Richard said it would be. It was not at the end of the conference table, not in the drawer beneath the screen, not under the stack of West Hollow project plans. Maggie turned on another light, and the brightness made the room clearer but no warmer. She opened each folder, at first with only the irritated exhaustion of someone too used to cleaning up another person's mistakes. Then she saw a thick white packet clipped together with a metal fastener. On the cover page were the words, Lawson Ridge Development, LLC. She went still. The name sounded like an expansion branch, a new project, something Richard might have mentioned in an excited voice and then forgotten to give her the detail. Maggie turned the first page. Articles of organization, registered agent, managing members. Her financial mind read faster than her heart could defend itself. Richard Lawson, Sabrina Cole, no Margaret Lawson, no Maggie. No trace at all of the woman who had put up her own private assets as collateral, so the bank would not drag the company under. She turned another page. Preferred supplier list. Several names matched the suppliers she had convinced to extend payment terms when Lawson Construction had been only weeks from bankruptcy. Target client list. 3 of the names were clients Maggie had personally called, using the personal credibility of her father, who had once worked in local banking, to keep them from walking away. Draft contract, a townhouse project Richard had told her still belonged to Lawson. Construction now appeared under Lawson Ridge. Worse than that, the old debts, the unpaid obligations, the personal guarantees, all the things Maggie had signed because she believed she was saving hours, remained with the old company. Lawson Construction would keep the risk, the dirt, the weight. Lawson Ridge would take the clean part, the new part, the part that could be presented to investors as a powerful fresh start. Maggie pulled out a conference chair and sat down, not because she wanted to sit, but because her knees had suddenly stopped trusting the floor. She did not cry. Financial betrayal does not stab into a person the way an affair in a bedroom does. It enters through small print, dates, signatures, cash flow, company names, and then blooms coldly in the stomach when a person understands that her loyalty has been turned into capital. She flipped to the final page. Company formation date was there, clear as an insult. 1 week after the day, she signed the loan guarantee that saved Richard from bankruptcy. Maggie placed her hand on the page. In that empty conference room, under the cold fluorescent light, she had once believed she had pulled her husband out of the ruins. That night, she understood he had only used her hands to dig his own escape route. 12 years earlier, Richard Lawson had entered Maggie's life with sun-browned hands, a wide smile, and the voice of a man who believed that with enough will, enough sweat, and enough people believing in him, anything could be raised from bare ground. They met at a Habitat for Humanity fundraiser in Fort Worth, where Maggie had attended on behalf of her boss because her company had sponsored a table. And Richard was a local contractor invited to give a short speech about how building houses was not just about putting up walls, but about giving people a place where they could believe I had a future. He wore a pale blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, read from no notes, and spoke in a masculine, easy voice that made the room laugh at the right moments and go quiet at the right moments. He did not seem rich. He did not seem polished, but he had something that attracted Maggie even more at the time. Belief in himself presented as obvious truth. Maggie was 30 then, already years into finance, accustomed to spreadsheets, risk, debt ratios, cash reserves, all the unromantic things that keep people from destroying themselves. She had dated a few safe, decent men with clear retirement plans, but none of them made her feel as if life could be wider than a repayment schedule. Richard talked about land, timber, roofs, morning light coming through windows, the way a properly designed kitchen could make a family want to sit together a little longer. He called a house something with a soul. Maggie, who had spent too many years believing that everything trustworthy had to be measurable, was seduced by a man who turned recklessness into poetry. In those first months, Richard made her feel less rigid. He took her to empty lots, stood in dry grass and read Texas dust, pointed at the air and described where a house would stand, where the living room windows would face the sunset, where the garage would be wide enough for a father to teach his son how to fix a car. Maggie laughed and told him he built whole lives in his head before he even had a permit. He kissed her forehead and said, "And you'll be the one who makes sure that life doesn't go bankrupt before anyone moves in." At first, she found that adorable. She liked feeling needed in a complimentary way. Richard dreamed, Maggie calculated. Richard opened doors, Maggie checked contracts. Richard got clients to sign because they liked him, and Maggie made sure the contract did not let him shoot himself in the foot. When they married, he said in his vows that she was the person who made the things he built not only rise, but stand firm. The whole room laughed and clapped. Maggie blushed, thinking it was love. Later, she would look back and wonder when a compliment had also contained the unpaid job description of her life. Richard often said, "I'm not good with paperwork. I'm good at building." That sentence appeared whenever a supplier invoice was forgotten, whenever tax records were missing documents, whenever payroll had to be checked, whenever construction insurance was due, whenever a client complained because a change order was unclear. Maggie initially found it almost endearing. He was a man of the field, of dust, hard hats, and freshly cut wood, while she was a woman of desks, numbers, and clauses. They were a team. She did not realize that a man who kept saying he was not good with paperwork might be teaching the whole world that paperwork was not his responsibility, while every consequence would eventually fall on the person who knew how to read. Red flags are always gentler when a person is in love. Richard would put a contract on the kitchen table and say, "Can you look this over for me just this once?" Once became 10 times. 10 times became the default. He would call her in the middle of her own workday, hurried and anxious. "Maggie, the client's asking about retainage. What's the cleanest way to say this?" She would stand in the office hallway, hand cupped over her phone, guiding him as if guiding someone holding something fragile. He came home with flowers after nights when she stayed up until midnight fixing his cash flow sheets, calling her his life-saving angel. She smiled, accepted the flowers, and told herself this was marriage. One person strong in one place, the other strong somewhere else. The problem was that over time, her strength became a resource he drew from without asking, while his weakness became a personality trait everyone was expected to understand. Lawson Construction grew faster than Richard's ability to manage it. At first, it was only home renovation projects around Dallas and Plano, then small new builds, then a few townhouse developments, then light commercial contracts. The office moved from a rented room behind a materials shop into a small building with a black steel logo mounted above the entrance. Company trucks drove all over the area. Richard appeared in a local magazine article about builders bringing character back to North Texas homes. He liked the article so much that he framed it and hung it in the hallway. Maggie was proud too. She did not deny that. She had once stood in the new office, watching employees move through the space, hearing phones ring, printers hum, people talk about permits and framing schedules, and thought this was something they had built together. But beneath the surface, the numbers began telling another story. Invoices were later. Suppliers called more often. Projects were taken on top of one another to create the appearance of growth, while cash reserves were almost non-existent. Richard used deposits from new projects to pay material costs on old ones and called it cash flow timing. Maggie called it dangerous. He said every construction company operated under cash pressure. She said pressure was different from suffocation. He laughed, kissed her shoulder while she sat at the dining table with her laptop open and said, "You look at spreadsheets like they're horror movies." She did not laugh, because to me, debt doesn't have a soundtrack. It just comes due. The first real fight about the company happened on a March evening, when a major concrete supplier sent a formal demand letter and threatened to sue. Maggie placed the letter in front of Richard on the kitchen table. You knew this was 60 days overdue. Richard had just come back from a job site, his shirt dusty, his face tired. "I'm handling it." "No, you're avoiding their phone calls." He pulled out a chair and sat down, rubbing his face. "You don't understand relationships in this industry. People threaten things. They're threatening in legal writing because you owe them more than $200,000. He looked at her, his eyes sharpening. "I don't need you reading numbers to me like I'm a student. I'm not reading them like a teacher. I'm reading them like a wife whose marital assets are tied to yours. This is my company." The sentence landed on the table like a stone. Maggie went silent. Richard realized it immediately, but pride kept him from taking it back. She looked at him for a long time and said, "When you need me to fix a contract at midnight, it's ours. When I ask about debt, it's yours." He exhaled. "I didn't mean it that way. You often don't mean the part that hurts me." He got up, walked to the back door, and looked out into the dark yard. "I'm trying to build something big, Maggie. You can't call every risk an opportunity, and you can't call every opportunity a danger. No, I just call debt debt." He said nothing after that. The fight ended in silence, like many others. But from that day on, Maggie began seeing Richard not only as a man with big dreams, but as a man so afraid that he had to call debt by another name so he would not see he was sinking. The night Richard confessed he was close to bankruptcy came at 2 in the morning, in the kitchen of their suburban Dallas home, where everything was usually orderly because Maggie could not stand cluttered surfaces after a day full of numbers. But that night, the kitchen table was covered in invoices, bank letters, printed supplier emails, payroll sheets, project lists, and Richard's handwritten notes with red circles and question marks. Maggie woke because she heard a drawer slam. She came downstairs in a robe, hair messy, eyes heavy, and found Richard sitting at the table under the yellow light, head bowed, both hands clasped behind his neck like a man waiting for the roof to collapse. He did not look up when she entered. "Tell me the truth," she said. It was not a question. She was too tired for softer versions of the truth. Richard stayed silent for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red and empty. "If I don't get money in the next 30 days, the company shuts down." Maggie felt her body separate from the room for 1 second. "How much?" He handed her a sheet of paper. She looked at the number, then looked again because she thought she had read it wrong. She had not. Supplier debt, payroll tax debt, a nearly maxed out line of credit, client advances misused against the wrong timeline, several projects that would trigger lawsuits if they stopped. "How long have you been hiding this level of debt from me?" Richard swallowed. "A few months. A few months or almost a year." He did not answer. She understood. "Richard." He struck the table with his palm, not hard enough to be violent, but hard enough to make several papers tremble. I know I ruined it. I know I don't deserve for you to save me." Maggie looked at him. It was a dangerous sentence, the sentence of a man who had punished himself just enough to make the woman beside him feel cruel if she punished him further. She said very slowly, "Don't say that if all you want is for me to prove the opposite." Richard looked at her as if she had stripped him bare. "I don't want to lose everything. You put everything on the table without telling me. I thought I could turn it around. That's the epitaph of a lot of companies." He He bowed his head, for once not arguing. Maggie stood in the kitchen, looking at the man she loved, at the pile of papers, at the shared life that could be dragged under by his ego. She was so angry her hands were shaking, but beneath the anger was something stronger, older, something marriage had grown inside her. Loyalty. She did not want to rescue Richard's pride. She did not want to reward his lies, but she could not stand still and watch their home, his employees, the people who had trusted the company, and her own future burned to the ground if she still knew how to pull it out of the fire. The next morning, while Dallas was still pale gray, and the heat had already begun rising from the pavement, Maggie called her father's old bank. She put her reputation on the table before she understood that reputation would be used as cap. The bank was a red brick building in the center of town, where her father had worked for 30 years before retiring, where a few people still remembered Maggie as the little girl who used to sit in a blue vinyl chair waiting for her father's shift to end. The new loan officer, Carl Whitman, was a few years younger than she was, but the branch manager was an older man who had once worked with her father. Maggie wore a dark blue suit and carried a folder arranged in precise order, not letting Richard speak too much in the meeting because she knew he would try to turn crisis into vision. She presented the debt, the cash flow, the assets, the active contracts, the restructuring plan, the negotiable obligations, the debts that had to be paid immediately, and the projects that should be cut loose. Richard sat beside her, grateful at first, but Maggie could see from the corner of her eye how his shoulders stiffened each time Carl looked at her instead of at him. "Maggie," Carl said near the end of the meeting, "if we do this, we're doing it because we believe you can keep the plan on track." Richard gave a strained smile. "The company is still mine." Carl nodded politely. "Of course, but you're very lucky to have her." The air in the room thickened in 1 second. Maggie should have felt pleased, because that compliment might help them save the company. But she looked at Richard and saw that his smile did not reach his eye. A drowning man may grab the hand that saves him, but once he is back on shore, he may hate that hand because it remembers he was ever underwater. For the next few weeks, Maggie had no life of her own. She did her own job during the day, then came home at night to do the work of saving Richard's company. She called every supplier, not in a begging voice, but in the voice of someone who understood that trust only returns when there is a clear repayment schedule. She told them Lawson Construction would pay in installments, that she would oversee cash flow, that if they pulled out immediately, everyone would lose more. Some agreed because they had once worked with her father. Some agreed because they believed Maggie would do what she said she would do. Some agreed only because they knew litigation would also take time. She used her own savings to handle emergency payroll because she could not bear the thought of employees going unpaid, because Richard had taken on too many projects to preserve an image. She put a small inheritance from her mother up as partial collateral for the restructured loan. Richard cried when she signed. He held her hand in the bank parking lot and said, "I'll never forget this." Maggie believed him, not because she was stupid, but because people rarely want to believe that the person they are saving is capable of resenting them for the act of being saved. She came home so exhausted that sometimes she fell asleep on the sofa in her work clothes. Richard covered her with a blanket, kissed her forehead, and called her my rock. She had once loved that name. Too late, she realized rocks are often what people stand on. Sabrina Cole appeared when the worst danger had passed, exactly when Richard had begun standing upright again and no longer wanted to look down at the mud on his shoes. She was introduced at Lawson Construction on a Monday morning, when Maggie stopped by to review the repayment schedule with the bookkeeper. Sabrina was nearly 12 years younger than Maggie, with honey blonde hair curled softly, tanned skin, a cream sheath dress, nude heels, a slim laptop tucked under her arm, and a smile as bright as a showroom. Richard stood beside her with an expression Maggie had not seen in a long time. The expression of a man who believed someone was looking at him like a founder, not like a debtor his wife had just pulled back from the edge. "Sabrina is going to help us rebrand," Richard said. "After everything that happened, the company needs a new story." Maggie looked from him to Sabrina. "Does the new story include paying off the old one?" Sabrina gave a light smile, either not understanding or pretending not to. "I believe a healthy brand has to face forward. Clients don't buy the past, they buy confidence in the future." Richard looked at Sabrina, almost proud. "That's exactly what I need." Maggie said nothing. She did not want to become the wife jealous of a younger consultant while the company was still recovering. She did not want to give Richard a chance to say she refused to see the future. But as Sabrina sat in the conference room talking about legacy, expansion, visibility, and leadership story. Maggie looked at the debt spreadsheets on her laptop and felt as if she were standing in the basement holding up the foundation, while someone else had already started decorating the roof for a party. Sabrina did not care about the debts, or at least she was skillful enough not to let them dirty the story she was selling Richard. She called him a visionary. She said men like him should not be defined by temporary cash pressure. She suggested changing the website, filming Richard on job sites at sunrise, using a rebuilt stronger narrative to regain market confidence. Maggie listened and found it funny in a way that was not amusing. The company had not rebuilt stronger. It was standing on her crutches, but Richard drank in every word from Sabrina like a thirsty man. One evening, when Maggie said payments to suppliers still had to be prioritized over the marketing budget, Richard sighed. "You always look at the debt, because the debt is still there. Sabrina can see the future." Maggie put down her pen. She arrived after everything had already been saved. Richard looked at her, and in his eyes was a resentment that had been simmering longer than she wanted to admit. "Maybe because she believes in the future, while you keep looking at me like a failure being managed." Maggie went silent. The sentence hurt because it took the nights she had spent saving him and turned them into proof that she had diminished him. "I look at risk because my signature is under it. You always have to bring up the signature, because the bank will bring it up if you forget." He got up and walked into the garage. Maggie remained at the table, listening to the door close, and for the first time understood that Richard's gratitude was turning into resentment. Some people cannot love the person who has seen them on their knees. They can only use that person until they stand again, then hate them for remembering how cold the floor was. In the months that followed, the company stabilized enough for Richard to start rewriting history. In front of employees, he said, "We turned it around." But the we grew blurrier every day. He talked about the new strategy, the new energy, the way Sabrina had helped the company reclaim its voice. During a meeting with a supplier, the man who had once agreed to extend payment because of Maggie's call shook Richard's hand and said, "Lucky your wife knows how to talk to banks." Richard laughed, placing a hand on Maggie's back, and replied, "Maggie has always liked controlling the details." The group laughed lightly. Maggie laughed too, because society teaches women to laugh when their contributions are turned into difficult personality traits. In the car on the way home, she said, "You could have said thank you instead of turning me into someone who likes control." Richard tightened his hands on the steering wheel. "God, Maggie, do you want me to spend the rest of my life being grateful to you? No, I want you not to rewrite history while my signature is still on the loan. I'm trying to get my self-respect back by erasing the person who helped you keep it." He glanced at her. "You don't understand what a man needs after being humiliated." Maggie turned to look out the car window, Dallas signs sliding past in the hard sunlight. "I understand. I just don't know why your self-respect always requires someone else to pay for it." The bank notification arrived on a Friday afternoon, seemingly harmless. An automated email confirming a new business account connected to contact information Maggie had provided during the restructuring process. The account name was unfamiliar, Lawson Ridge Development, LLC. At first, she thought it was a new project branch of Lawson Construction that Richard had forgotten to mention. But Maggie was not someone who ignored fine print. She searched the public business records, checked the Secretary of State filings, found the registration date, managing members, and registered address. Richard Lawson, Sabrina Cole, temporary address, Richard and Maggie's home. She sat in her own company office, the screen glowing in front of her, every sound around her turning into a distant layer of stats. Sabrina's name sat beside Richard's in a new entity, clean, debt-free, untouched by the history of near bankruptcy. And the formation date, as she would later see in the file in the conference room, fell immediately after the day she signed the guarantee. This was no longer jealousy. Jealousy was too small for a structure. This was a plan, an escape map drawn with the very ink she had supplied. That night, Richard came home late and said he had been in a branding meeting with Sabrina. Maggie watched him place his keys on the tray, watched the construction dust on his shoes, watched the man who had once held her in the bank parking lot and said he would never forget. She did not ask, not because she feared the answer, because for the first time, she understood that if she asked too soon, he would move faster. Maggie began doing what she did best, reading. Not reading like a wife, reading like the forensic accountant of her own life. She created a secure folder on her personal laptop and gave it a name that meant nothing. She saved copies of the loan guarantee, Richard's 2 in the morning emails, messages in which he wrote, "I can't do this without you." The debt restructuring agreements, supplier payment schedules, call records where she had them, Lawson Ridge filings, lists of clients being gradually moved into new proposals, marketing expenses paid to Sabrina and unclear, consulting, payments from Lawson construction accounts. She reviewed statements, matched dates, read small cash movements the way someone studies blood on a floor. Payment to Sabrina Cole, consulting, matched the same day Richard had said he needed money for a material deposit. A deleted forwarded email still remained in the archive. Once old debt is contained, Rich can launch without legacy baggage. Legacy baggage. Maggie read that phrase again and again. Legacy baggage was the debt she had guaranteed, the suppliers she had reassured, the employees whose payroll she had helped cover, the company she had dragged back from the cliff. She was no longer a wife in his story. She was baggage. The downtown apartment appeared through a secondary address Sabrina, used on several delivery documents. A luxury building near the center of Dallas, with a glass lobby, a security desk, large potted plants, and people walking in with laptops, food bags, and garment bags as if they were living cleaner lives than the one outside. Maggie was not the kind of person who followed people. She had always thought she had too much self-respect to sit in a car watching her husband. But self-respect is not always the refusal to look. Sometimes self-respect is looking long enough to stop being deceived. She parked across the street on a hot afternoon, the air conditioner running quietly, her hands resting on the steering wheel. After 40 minutes, Richard appeared. He was not dressed for a job site and did not carry the tiredness of a man coming out of a difficult meeting. He wore a linen shirt, carried a bag of food and a tube of drawings. Sabrina opened the door before he even rang. She wore white jeans, a pale blue blouse, her hair down, smiling at him like someone used to wait. Richard leaned down and kissed her cheek. A quick, natural kiss, not large enough to be cinematic, but ordinary enough to kill whatever was left inside Mag. They went inside shoulder to shoulder, carrying drawings, laptops, food, a new future packaged like an after-hours work session. Maggie did not cry. She took pictures. Her hands were very steady. The deepest pain was not that Sabrina was younger, not the kiss. The deepest pain was understanding that, while Maggie used her reputation to keep the old company from dying, Richard had used that survival time to build a new room where she had no key. The second time she went, she did not need to see the kiss. She needed to hear. She stood near the parking area, pretending to be on the phone as Richard, and Sabrina walked out of the lobby late at night, their voices low but close enough. Sabrina said, "I don't want Lawson Construction dragging Rich down. You promised everything would be clean." Richard answered, "Once the old debt is contained, we can finally move without her." There was no thunder, no music, only a very neat, very practical sentence. Move without her. Maggie stood beneath the yellow entrance light, hearing the phrase enter her like a thin blade. Not once I tell Maggie, not once I leave her properly, not once she's protected. When the old debt was contained, when risk was boxed in, when the clean assets were transferred, when she, the woman who had guaranteed, called the bank, used her savings, became something that could be left behind. That night when she came home, Richard was in the bathroom and Maggie stood in the kitchen, opened the evidence folder and looked at her signature on the guarantee. She said softly, only loud enough for herself to hear, "If my signature saved him, it can also prove he betrayed me." Maggie's lawyer was Evelyn Grant, a specialist in commercial and complex divorce matters, with an office in a glass building in Dallas that somehow avoided the cold showiness of power. Evelyn was about 55. With black hair threaded with gray and eyes sharpened by hearing too many lies wrapped in business language. Maggie brought a hard drive, 2 paper folders, a timeline, a cash flow chart, a list of assets, and the Lawson Ridge filing. Evelyn read for a long time without interrupting with pity. That made Maggie trust her more. Near the end of the meeting, Evelyn removed her glasses and set them on the desk. "I'll be direct. This isn't just marital betrayal. There may be issues of fraudulent transfer, concealment of marital assets, breach of fiduciary duty, and if marital assets or your personal credit were used to restore value, and he then shifted that value into a new entity to cut you out, we have grounds to act aggressively." Maggie heard those cold words and felt something strange. Did not frighten her the way she expected. They made her steadier. When pain has legal names, It stops feeling like jealousy and begins to feel like a provable truth. Evelyn continued, "Do not confront him yet. Do not sign anything. Do not leave the house while marital assets and records are still there. Do not send emotional emails. Let him grow a little more confident. Men like Richard often don't think the person who saved them will be able to read the entire exit plan." Maggie looked out the window, where Dallas shone hotly beneath the sun. "I used to think loyalty was something to be proud of," Evelyn replied. "It still is. This time, you just need to stop letting someone else use it as liquid capital." Richard wanted her to sign again over a fake dinner in their dining room, where Maggie had once hosted small client gatherings, where Richard had once raised a glass and said she was the reason he never forgot what all of this was for. He made steak, or rather bought steak and overcooked it, opened an expensive bottle of red wine, and placed the papers beside the plate as though documents could become harmless if placed near candles. Sabrina had taught him something about presentation, Maggie thought. Richard wore a white shirt with no tie, trying to look more like a husband than a businessman. "I want to simplify the company structure," he said after they had eaten a few bites. "You've carried too much. I think it's time to free you from the pressure of operations." Maggie looked at the folder. "By taking me out of the thing I saved." He exhaled, half laugh, half fatigue. "You always talk like everything is a battle." "No, I'm just starting to read carefully before I sign." Richard looked at her longer than usual. "I'm not hiding anything from you." Maggie set down her knife. "Then you won't mind if Evelyn reviews this first." "Who is Evelyn?" "My lawyer." The word changed his face very slightly. "Not panic, not yet. Just a crack in his confidence. You hired a lawyer to look at paperwork from your husband's company. My husband is asking me to sign paperwork. I'm trying to protect you. You say that more often whenever the paperwork protects you." He went silent. Then his voice lowered. "Sabrina said you might react like this." A coldness ran through Maggie, but she smiled. "Good. Next time she can also predict that I won't sign." Richard stood, pushing his chair back harder than necessary. "You don't trust me anymore?" Maggie looked at him. "No, I've just stopped trusting in place of evidence." The meeting with Sabrina happened 2 days later, in the Lawson construction office after everyone had gone home. Maggie arrived to pick up a contract, or at least that was what she told the receptionist. Sabrina was still in Richard's office, the door slightly open, a small laugh drifting out. When Richard stepped out to take a phone call, Maggie walked in. Sabrina sat on the leather sofa, laptop open, with a mood board for Lawson Ridge in front of her, though the logo in the corner had been covered with a sheet of paper. She looked up, her smile polite. "Maggie, Sabrina." The air between them needed no introduction. Sabrina closed her laptop slowly. "I'm not sure you should be here after hours." Maggie looked around the office, where she had once paid the electricity bill when the company was almost cut off. "I have a fairly long history with this place." Sabrina stood, smoothing her dress. "Richard is trying to move forward. I hope you won't drag him back with old history." Maggie looked at her. "Old history is the loan that's still active this month. He needs someone who believes in the vision, not someone who reminds him of failure. He already had a clean start." "I paid for it." Sabrina's mouth curved faintly. "That doesn't mean you own him." Maggie stepped closer to the desk and rested a hand on the wood surface. "No, but it does mean I can trace what he built with my money, my credit, and my signature." For the first time, Sabrina's eyes lost their shine. "You can't prove anything that matters." Maggie looked at her, almost pitying her for the confidence Richard's version had fed. "People always say that before they realize what paperwork remembers." Sabrina did not answer. When Richard returned, he found the two women facing each other in his office. And for 1 second, Maggie saw what he feared most. The two versions of his story had begun standing in the same room. The Lawson Construction brand recovery event was held at a high-end materials showroom, with faux brick walls, reclaimed wood, warm amber lighting, cocktail tables, a few local investors, former clients, suppliers, employees, and a reporter from a regional business magazine. Richard called it a relaunch reception, saying they needed to show the market that Lawson Construction had come through the crisis. Maggie wore a simple black dress, very little jewelry, and stood in the corner with a glass of sparkling water. She watched familiar faces, people she had once called until her voice was nearly hoarse, trying to convince them not to walk away. Now shaking Richard's hand, praising his strength, calling him an example of resilience. Sabrina glided through the groups, perfect in a white suit, introducing the new strategy, talking about the future pipeline, about clean growth. a phrase that made Maggie want to laugh because of how dirty it was. Richard stepped onto the small stage, microphone in hand, his face bright beneath the lights. He spoke about hardship, leadership, about how a real builder is not measured by where he stands at the top, but by how he rises after the storm. People nodded. He thanked the team, thanked the suppliers for believing, thanked Sabrina, whom he called the future of this company. Applause rose. Then he looked toward Maggie, his smile measured. And of course my wife Maggie, who stood by me. That was all. The wife who stood by him, not the woman who signed the guarantee, not the woman who negotiated with the bank, not the woman who used her savings, not the woman who saved payroll, a moral accessory in the story of his resurrection. Maggie set down her glass, not loudly angry. Her anger had already been arranged into files. She waited for Richard to finish, waited for the applause to fade, waited for Sabrina to step up and accept praise with her beautifully modest smile. Then Maggie walked forward. No one stopped her because they thought she was a wife about to say a few touching words. Richard looked at her, surprised but still smiling until he saw her eye. Maggie, you don't need to. She took the microphone from the event coordinator. I won't speak long. The room softened into silence. Richard is right about one thing. This company survived because someone believed in it. But belief is not a decorative word for a stage. Belief has a signature. It has collateral. It has phone calls with the bank. It has suppliers persuaded not to sue. It has savings withdrawn to make payroll when the man on this stage had not yet admitted the company was nearly out of cash. The air in the room changed. Richard took one step forward. Maggie, this is not the time. She turned to him, her voice still calm. You're right, Richard. This company survived because someone believed in it. But don't confuse the person who believed in you with the man who tried to erase her afterward. She placed a folder on the podium. She did not reveal everything. Evelyn had told her not to turn evidence into a show unless necessary. But it was enough for the room to see the heading. Lawson Ridge Development, LLC. Managing members, Richard Lawson, Sabrina Cole, data formation. A murmur moved through the room. Sabrina turned pale. Richard stared at the documents, as if staring at a bomb he could not touch in front of witnesses. At that same moment, Richard's phone buzzed. Then Sabrina's, then the company lawyers. A legal notice from Evelyn Grant had been sent to Richard, Sabrina, and Lawson Ridge Development, demanding preservation of records, temporary suspension of asset transfers, and disclosure of transactions related to Lawson Construction and Maggie's personal guarantee. Maggie set down the microphone. She walked away from the podium, neither quickly nor slowly. Behind her, the story Richard had built began to crack to the tiny sound of people opening email. After the event, Richard pulled Maggie into the back office of the showroom. He shut the door hard. For the first time in years, his public charm fell away completely. What have you done? The thing you feared most. I read you destroyed the company. No, I shined a light on where you were moving it. Lawson Ridge was a backup plan, with Sabrina as managing member. She understands the business. She understands how to stand beside the clean part after I cleaned up the dirty part. He pointed at her. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Maggie looked at him, so tired her voice was almost gentle. I understand. I paid for it. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair. I was going to tell you, no, you were going to leave clean. I did it to protect the future. Whose future? He went silent. That was the answer. Maggie opened her bag and placed a timeline on the table. The date of the guarantee, the date Lawson Ridge was formed, the payments to Sabrina, the client list, the email about legacy baggage, the apartment photos. Tomorrow, the court will know what you transferred. Richard looked at the papers, then at her, and his anger turned into pleading so quickly it sickened her. Maggie, please, you can't do this to me. She gave a very small smile, more sad than cold. You're still using that line after all of this. I'll lose everything. No, you're losing the things you tried to keep by betraying the person who saved you. He stepped closer, his voice low. You used to love me. I used to save you. You confused the two with permission. The weeks that followed did not bring blazing justice. There were injunctions, subpoenas, bank meetings, lawyer emails, legal fees that made Maggie nauseous, and nights when she stayed awake rereading documents until her eyes hurt. Richard told people Maggie was retaliating because she was jealous of Sabrina. Evelyn responded with cash flow records. Richard said Lawson Ridge had not truly begun operation. Maggie produced draft contracts and client transfers. Richard said Sabrina was only a consultant. Sabrina, once she felt the ship sinking, hired her own lawyer, and suddenly began protecting herself by keeping copies of emails Richard had sent. Investors paused. A major client withdrew from a contract because they did not want to be trapped in an asset dispute. Several suppliers who had once extended payment because Maggie called now supported her with affidavits, stating clearly that they had trusted the repayment plan because Maggie had committed to overseeing it, not because of Richard. That was the blow Richard had not prepared for. He had thought the ecosystem believed in him because he was the builder, the visionary, the man of his word. It turned out many people had trusted Maggie, standing behind his word. Once she stepped out of his shadow, his word became visibly lighter. Sabrina left him before the case was over. Maggie heard it from Evelyn, not directly. Sabrina had turned over some documents to protect herself, proving Richard had told her everything was clean, that Maggie was merely a controlling wife trapping him in the old company. In the downtown apartment, Sabrina and Richard fought loudly enough that building security recorded a noise complaint. She did not want to be pulled into litigation. She did not want her name attached to a fraudulent transfer. She had loved, or thought she loved, the version of Richard who was rising, the strong man with a new company, new projects, a new legacy. When he returned to being an exposed debtor, her devotion evaporated faster than his promises. Maggie heard this and felt no joy, no great satisfaction, only a cold logic. Someone who builds with betrayal will be betrayed when the foundation begins to crack. She had once thought Sabrina had taken something that belonged to her. Now she understood Sabrina had only taken the version of Richard that Maggie had funded, polished, and held upright. When the support was removed, even Sabrina did not want to stand near him. Richard's final call came at midnight in the kitchen of their house, where there was no longer dinner waiting for him, no debt folder spread across the table, no Maggie sitting with a laptop saving cash flow. She was still in the house because Evelyn had advised her not to leave until assets were handled. But the house had changed its weather. Richard slept in the guest room or often did not come home at all. That night, his name lit up her phone. Maggie watched it ring for a long time before answering. Richard's voice on the other end was hoarse, exhausted, stripped of its masculine confidence. Sabrina left. Maggie looked out into the dark yard. I know, he gave a dry laugh. Of course you know. Your lawyer knows everything. She said nothing, he sighed. Clients are pulling out. The bank is putting pressure on me. Evelyn is choking me with paperwork. The paperwork is only repeating what you did. You proved what you wanted to prove. Can you stop now? Maggie closed her eyes. That sentence contained all of Richard. Not an apology for deceiving her. Not grief over turning her loyalty into his bridge out. He still thought this was about proof. An ego battle, something she could stop if she loved him enough. You still think this is about proving something. I'm going to lose everything. You didn't lose everything when I signed the guarantee for you. You lost it when you decided to use it to build your way out of me. Maggie, I don't know what to do. She went silent. This was the old moment. A drowning man calling the woman who had once pulled him out. She felt the old instinct stir, small but still alive. Ask where he was, ask whether he had eaten, ask whether he needed her to call someone. She let that instinct pass through her like an old nerve pain. This time you'll have to find someone else to manage your consequences, she said. Or manage them yourself. Richard was quiet. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller. You're really going to let me fall? Maggie looked at her signature on the copy of the guarantee lying in the folder on the table. No, Richard. For the first time, I'm not jumping in with you. She hung up. She did not shake. She did not cry right away. But afterward, she sat in the kitchen for a long time. Because not saving someone you once loved does not feel like victory. It feels like cutting away a reflex that has lived inside you for too long. Months later, the settlement was finalized in a cold, bright lawyer's office, where there was no room for emotion at the table because paperwork had taken up all the space. Maggie was released from most of her personal guarantees, or reimbursed through assets and equity of equivalent value. The transfers to Lawson Ridge were reversed or compensated. Lawson Ridge lost its principal contract, then was dissolved far more quietly than it had been created. Richard had to sell part of his assets and lost the operational control he had once held in order to pay debt and stabilize remaining obligation. Lawson Construction did not become a shining dream again. It became a smaller business, more tightly supervised, less glamorous, and for the first time unable to live off the myth that Richard was a man who had built everything from nothing with his own two hands. Maggie did not take the company for revenge. She took back her portion of the truth inside it. Every line of the settlement was a piece of dignity pulled from the wreckage of a false story. Not enough to return the nights she stayed awake saving him. Not enough to erase the feeling of Sabrina looking at her, as if she were old history to be cleared away. Not enough to make her loyalty whole again, but enough to keep Richard from walking away with the cleanest part and leaving her in the mud. The day Maggie left the house they had shared, Dallas was hot and clear, with no rain, no cinematic sign that her life had just closed a door. She stood in the kitchen, looking at the stone countertop where Richard had once spread invoices at 2 in the morning, where she had once signed papers, once drunk cold coffee, once placed her hand on his forehead when he said he did not deserve to be saved. She did not hate him completely. That made her tired. Kind memories still existed, and their existence did not absolve anyone. Richard had once made her laugh, once brought home flowers, once stood in the middle of an empty lot talking about houses with soul. But he had also used her loyalty as capital, her signature as a bridge, her reputation as armor, then prepared to push her off that bridge once he thought he had crossed the river. Maggie picked up her car keys and walked outside. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Richard. "I never would have survived without you." She read it. Once that sentence might have softened her. Now it only made her see an old truth spoken too late, and for the wrong reason. She did not answer. She put the phone in her bag, locked the door, and walked to her car. Maggie survived, but she did not return as the woman who had once believed loyalty alone could make a marriage worthy. She kept working, kept reading contracts, kept staying calm in meetings. People told her she was strong, and she learned not to resent them for not understanding that strength is sometimes just a prettier name for no longer knowing where to collapse. She no longer signed anything because of love without reading it like a stranger would. She no longer heard, "I need you," and mistook it for proof of intimacy. Some nights she missed Richard the way a person misses a house that has burned down, not because she wants to live in the ashes again, but because there had once been a few rooms inside it that were truly warm. But warm memories do not change the structure of a fire. She had saved him from bankruptcy with her money, her name, her reputation, and every last bit of trust left in a marriage far too accustomed to her holding it upright. He used it to build an exit, but when Maggie took back the truth, Richard learned the hardest lesson of his life. A man who survives on someone else's loyalty should never mistake that loyalty for weakness.